What happens if something goes wrong in an async action? In other words, what happens if we get an exception? Well, I've already shown you one example of what happens when we get a timeout exception and how we can go to a specific view using a handle error attribute. But what about other types of exceptions? Exceptions that might be thrown by WCF, or exceptions that are just generally thrown by an async method that we call into. So the scenario now is we're going to call getCurrentTemperatureAsync. It is ultimately going to throw an exception. And we'll call getHeadlineAsync, and it's ultimately going to throw an exception. And I'll point out that the first call we make is to getHeadlineAsync. So that would be the first call that we make here. And so with that in place, let's see how the application behaves. I'm going to change the timeout so that we don't get a timeout error here. And I'm also going to go back into webconfig and turn off custom errors so we can see the exception that gets thrown and see a stack trace. And once that's built, let me come out and refresh the browser. And what we'll see is the system.exception no news that was thrown by our async news method. So if you expected to see an aggregate exception, then you've probably worked with the task parallel library before, because an aggregate exception is what the TPL uses to wrap up exceptions that are happening from multiple operations that are executing in parallel. Wraps up all the different exceptions, puts them into a single aggregate exception, and then you can inspect that to see the different things that went wrong. But the TPL behaves a little bit differently with the await operator in place, and there still is an aggregate exception behind the scenes with all of the exceptions that have happened, but the runtime is only going to throw the first exception from that list of exceptions. That's what you're going to see. That's what you could try to put inside of a try-catch. And so your try-catch can be set up pretty normally. You don't have to worry about aggregate exception. You can just try to catch the exceptions that you expect these async operations to throw. The one you'll see is whichever one came out first.